All right, diving into our last game, we have Pentala Harikrishna versus Magnus Carlsen from the 2020 Chessable's Masters Tournament. Now in the game, Pentala opens 1e4, best by test. Magnus responds with 1c5 as usual, the Sicilian, and from here, both sides head straight for the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense. We've seen this in all 5 videos so far in this series. Now the key move e5 from black, of course, knocking off the knight on the d4 square. The knight jumps to b5, the main move. Threatening knight d6, black goes d6 guarding, and then bishop g5 on the board. Now, in the last game in this series, we saw the main line of this positional line where white goes knight d5, then bishop takes g6, and finally c3. Here in this game, we're going to see the other main option for white. That is an early c4. So here's how it goes. a6, knight a3, b5, cutting off the knight from the c4 square. Then the knight jumps into the d5 square as usual, the 9 knight d5 positional line. Black goes bishop e7. White takes on f6, gaining control of that d5 square permanently. Black recaptures. And here's the big branching point. In the last game, we saw white goes c3. However, in this game, Pentala is going to go for the other line, c4. Now, this is a much slower move, and it's a lot less complicated than c3. When white goes c3 in this position, again, white can go bishop d3, knight c2 to e3, and there's still a lot of tension in the position overall. However, when white goes c4, this typically leads to a very blocked position on the queen side. Here, of course, black has the option. Do you take on c4? Do you go b4? Do you do nothing? Well, first of all, doing nothing doesn't work. White's going to take on b5 with the pawn, then recapture with the knight, and basically win a free pawn for nothing. Of course, the pawn being attacked 3 times by the pawn, the knight, and the bishop, so there's no good way for black to defend. If black does take on c4, then white just goes bishop takes c4, developing his bishop with tempo, and that bishop is very well placed on the c4 square, hitting f7, and here black has to be super careful. So overall, b takes c4 really not played at the highest level. Instead, the main move here for black is going to be b4. Now, this is a very committal decision. On the one hand, you are hitting the knight with tempo, not a bad idea. However, after knight to c2, again, black needs to defend the pawn, and the best way to do it is with the move a5. That's what Magnus does in the game. But now here we have this blocked structure on the queen side. So those pawns on a5 and b4 aren't really going anywhere. White can go for a pawn break with a3, but overall, this leads to a very fixed sort of position on the queen side, and we enter a very slow maneuvering game for both sides. Now here, Pentala has some different options. He goes to the main line with g3. Obviously, this move is setting up bishop g2, getting the bishop on the long diagonal. Here, bishop d3 is technically possible, but overall, it's not really as strong. Black is not threatening f5 in this position. And if black never goes for that, then it's going to be a lot harder to justify the bishop being on the d3 square. So this is a great position in the Sveshnikov for white to go for g3, bishop g2. Perhaps he even wants to threaten h4 at some point, getting space on the king side, maybe threatening h5. Again, it's going to be more of a slow positional game from here. Now, Magnus, how does he continue? In the game, he goes g6. Solid move. The idea is perhaps he wants to go bishop g7 next, retreating the bishop, keeping the bishop alive. And if black gets that in, he may even follow up with the move f5, gaining space on the king side. This is a very common idea in these slower positional lines with 9 knight d5 and the Sveshnikov. So obviously, white doesn't want to allow that from black. That'd be very good for black. So he simply chops off that bishop on the f6 square. Knight takes f6. Then the queen takes. And then from here, both sides just continue developing and castling. So white bishop g2, then black castles, then white castles. And now here, the opening phase of the game is essentially over. Both sides have castled. So what are the plans for both sides here? Well, white's idea is pretty simple. He's perhaps going to go queen d2 or queen d3, then put one of the rooks on the d-file, trying to pressure the weak pawn on the d6 square. Of course, black doesn't have a dark squared bishop, so black may have to defend with one of the rooks on d8 or a6. And from there, perhaps white could think about breaking on the queen side with the move a3, or trying to gain space on the king side with perhaps h4 to h5. Of course, f4 from white would be very risky. White doesn't really want to do that. So instead, the main pawn breaks, again, are a3 or perhaps h4, expanding on the king side. Now, what about black? What should black be doing? Well, Magnus Carlsen has a few different ideas. One is rerouting the knight to a better square. On c6 is not really doing a whole lot. d4 is never really going to be a good square for the knight because white controls it so well. Perhaps he's going to go knight b8 to d7, then c5. And beyond that, perhaps he wants to use the bishop to put pressure on that pawn on e4. Maybe bishop b7 or maybe bishop b6. And finally, the move f5 is very playable in this Sveshnikov. However, Magnus does have to be super careful. If he plays that too early, white could perhaps take on f5, then activate this bishop on the long diagonal. So now here it is Magnus Carlsen's turn. In the game, he goes bishop b7. This move turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Not a major one, but overall, perhaps it would have been better leave the bishop on c8 for now. It may want to go to the e6 square. There's no real need to commit the bishop that early. But Magnus, he knows what he's doing. In the game, Pentala Harikrishna goes queen d2, setting up either rook a d1 or rook f d1 next. Again, putting pressure on that weak pawn on the d6 square. Very logical move. Now Magnus reroutes the knight, starting with the move knight to b8. His idea here is going to be knight d7 and then knight to c5. From c5, both his knight and his bishop will be pressuring that pawn on e4. So this certainly makes a lot of sense by Magnus. Now here Pentala, rook f d1, good move, targeting the weak pawn on the d6 square and keeping the rook on a1. That way he can go for the a3 pawn break later. Now, of course, here Magnus has to defend. The only way to defend the pawn is with one of those rooks. In the game, he goes rook to a6, a very creative move, lifting the rook along the 6th rank to defend the pawn. Now here white, queen e3, continuing developing. Black goes knight d7. Again, the plan is knight to c5. And here, white, his only real way to make progress besides h4, obviously black could block that with h5 and it wouldn't get anywhere. White's really only idea is a3, trying to break on the queen side. And that is what he does in the game. Now, of course, here white is threatening a takes b5, then perhaps rook takes, and then knight takes b5, winning a pawn, so black has to respond. In the game, he goes rook b6. A good move. The only weakness of this move is the queen does target the rook right now, and that means the knight isn't able to move anywhere else. Of course, c5 is the only good square for the knight anyways, so not that big of a deal, but Magnus will have to be careful about that. Now here Pentala takes on b4, a takes, and then rook to a4, targeting the pawn, very logical move. Here Magnus simply goes b3, expanding on the queen side. Now this is a very good move. It's also very double-edged. The advantage for Magnus is now the pawns on the b2 square and the c4 square are disconnected. We see this kind of idea a lot in the Roy Lopez for black, especially the closed Roy Lopez or various anti-Marshall systems. So excellent idea. The only drawback is that pawn on the b3 square could be vulnerable, so Magnus is going to have to defend it very carefully. Now here, of course, the knight on c2 being attacked. In the game, Magnus goes knight to e1, then knight to c5 from Magnus. Now, this is part of Magnus Carlsen's long-term plan. That knight is terrifically placed. It's pressuring rook a4 right now. It defends the pawn on the b3 square, and it pressures the pawn on the e4 square. So, very good multi-purpose move. Now, Pentala retreats the rook to a3. Good square, applying long-term pressure on that pawn on the b3 square. And Magnus is not a fan of that, so here he goes rook to a6, trying to get the rooks off the board. And that is what happens. Rook takes, bishop takes. And then Magnus has some pressure on that pawn on the c4 square, so Pentala defends bishop f1. So now overall, this position is looking relatively equal. Magnus does have a little bit of pressure here, but of course Magnus is rated approximately 150 ELO points higher than his opponent, and for that reason, he's trying to play for a win here. So let's see how Magnus slowly turns up the pressure in this game in a way that only Magnus Carlsen can do. In the game, rook to c8, increasing the pressure on that pawn on c4, Pentala goes knight f3, then bishop b7, reapplying pressure on the pawn on e4 now. Now, from here, white goes knight d2, defending the pawn. That knight does a good job of defending everything, but now look at white's pieces. The knight on d2 and the bishop on f1, very, very passive. All they're doing is defending their own pawns. Meanwhile, black here is the one applying all the pressure. So now we enter a slow maneuvering phase. We're going to skip through a lot of these moves. Not a whole lot happens here. White expands on the king side. Black obviously blocks it with the move h5. And we keep going a few more moves all the way up until right here. Here in this position, Magnus plays the move bishop c6, forcing the rooks off the board. Obviously, there's nowhere the rook can go. And in case you were curious here, rook takes b3 is an option. However, if white does that, black's going to have a number of different options. Rook to a1 is a great move, getting the rook on the back rank. And white's rook is never going to be able to defend. Other than that, knight c5 also possible, forking both the rook and the pawn on the e4 square. And then black's going to have these very powerful central pawns here. So rook takes b3 is playable, but it's not very attractive either. In the game, Pentala Harikrishna goes rook takes a8, getting the rooks off the board. Here, Magnus takes back with the queen. And now, of course, we have a very interesting position where black has pressure on that pawn on the e4 square. Meanwhile, white is threatening queen takes b3. Now, fortunately for us, these pawns do come off the board, and that gives us a little bit of an imbalance in this position. Queen takes b3, then bishop takes, and now suddenly it's white's queenside pawns versus Magnus Carlsen's central pawns. And that is the imbalance he needed in this game to be able to press for a win. So overall, Magnus is very happy with this new development. Now, Pentala, queen to e3, bringing the queen back to the defense of the king side. Bishop b7 for Magnus, freeing up the queen to move perhaps to a1 next. And here Pentala, his main plan is going to be getting those queenside pawns rolling. The best move here for him is probably going to be b4, just immediately expanding with that passed pawn. Instead, here, he goes for a very different idea, c5. Now, this move may look very strange. After all, black has that square guarded by both the pawn and the knight. Isn't white just losing a pawn? Well, not exactly. The tactics work out where this move doesn't lose a pawn. Here's why. If black takes with the d pawn, d takes c5, then obviously knight takes e5 or queen takes e5 is going to regain the pawn immediately. However, if black takes with the knight, as Magnus did in the game, that is the best move. Then the move knight takes e5 is possible. This is what Pentala played in the game. And here black takes the knight, then white obviously wins the knight on the c5 square as that pawn on d6 is now being overloaded. Now, instead of going for that line, here Magnus plays a much stronger idea, queen to a1, a very powerful multi-purpose move, forking both the pawn on the b2 square and the h1 square. And if white doesn't do anything, let's say white defends the pawn, I don't know, queen to c3, then queen h1 is literally checkmate. The king is nowhere to go. So obviously white has to respond to that threat. In the game, he does. He goes knight to f3, blocking off the long diagonal here. Now queen h1, not a good move at all for black. But that does mean Magnus Carlsen wins the pawn on the b2 square. And now suddenly Magnus is up a clean pawn on the d6 square. So obviously a very good development for Magnus in terms of being able to win this game in the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Now from here, Pentala tries to increase the pressure on the king side. However, it only leads to a bunch of exchanges. Here, bishop f3, then the bishops come off the board. And then here, we just have this weird position where both sides are dancing around with their queens and their knights for a very long period of time. We're going to fast forward a little bit. Here, Magnus does go queen to d5, pinning the knight. There is the threat of knight to d4. If Magnus can get that in, all the queens and the knights are going to come off the board. Then Magnus is going to be left with that one passed pawn on the d6 square. So obviously, Pentala sees that. King g1. And again, some more maneuvering phase moves. Magnus bringing his king back to the e7 square. Pentala trying to give more checks. Magnus constantly threatening the queen trade, and Pentala constantly denying it. He needs to keep the queens on the board in order to maintain counterplay. If the queens come off, it's going to be so much easier for Magnus to win in the endgame. Now here we have some more maneuvering checks. Both sides kind of going back and forth for a little while. Fast forwarding to this position right here. Here's one of the critical positions. Here, Magnus Carlsen is done waiting around. He's done with these weird waiting moves. Here, he finally expands on the king side with a very strong idea, g5. Okay, what's the idea behind this move? Well, first of all, if white takes on g5 with the pawn, knight takes g5 is the key idea. And then, of course, the queens and the knights are going to be traded off. For example, white does anything, queen b3, then queen takes, knight takes, king takes, then king e7, and here Magnus has a winning endgame. It's very simple. You just push this pawn down the board, escorted by the king. Eventually you abandon it. White's going to have to win it with the king. Then you come over here and gobble up all of white's kingside pawns and push your own kingside pawns. Very simple king and pawn endgame. Obviously, Pentala cannot go for that. So h takes g5, not a good move. Knight takes g5, also not a legal move, as the knight is being pinned to the king. So here, what is white supposed to do? Well, he finds the best idea, king g1, getting the king out of the pin with the knight. So now, of course, h takes g5 is a possibility, and the knight is still being defended by the queen temporarily. But here, Magnus expands again, g4, very good idea. Now the knight jumps forward, and the knights come off the board. Now here, this is a very good development for Magnus. First of all, his pawn on g4 acts as a wedge. It limits the white's king's mobility. For example, f3 is always going to be a good square for the queen now. And beyond that, the pawn on the g5 square is very, very weak. Perhaps Magnus can target it. And believe it or not, there's even one more idea. At some point, Magnus may be able to play the brilliant idea of h4, basically trying to blow open the king side. There may be some tactics later in the game where that does work out in his favor. For now, Magnus just giving some checks. Queen e1, king g2, queen e5, targeting the pawn on the g5 square. Now, Pentala gives the check on the a8 square, queen to a8, king e7 from Magnus. And here Pentala makes a very weak move, queen to g8. Turns out, white simply had to give up that pawn on the g5 square. For example, the top computer line, queen to b8. Things are very, very complicated here. It's beyond the scope of a Sveshnikov opening video, so we'll keep going a little bit faster here. Queen g8 does defend the pawn, but here the problem is Magnus Carlsen has a brilliant idea of playing the move h4. Now, this wasn't played in the game, but I have to show you this idea. Here, if white takes the pawn on the h4 square, g takes h4, that was effectively forced as Magnus is threatening h3, getting a permanent pass pawn on the h3 square. That would be devastating for white. So, g takes h4 is the best move, but then from here, Magnus has a way of basically blowing open the kingside with a series of checks, then going g3. Then if white takes, for example, queen takes g3, followed by winning the pawn on the h4 square, and as more and more of these pawns come off the board, Magnus Carlsen's one pawn advantage becomes more and more important. So h4 would have been a way for him to simplify into a completely winning queen and pawn endgame. However, in the game, he doesn't find it. Instead, queen to e4 on the board, hitting the king with check. The king goes back. Then queen g6, offering the queen trade. If white takes on g6, again, this passed pawn on the d6 square is going to decide the game. So, of course, Pentala denies it. Queen to c8, very good idea. Now, from here, we have some more series of checks. Both sides just trying to maneuver around, find the best squares for their queen and their king, until finally coming up in this position right here. Here, Magnus Carlsen wants to avoid a draw by repetition. He goes d5, finally moving a pawn, and potentially threatening to escort that pawn all the way down the board. Now, the drawback of this move is the pawn is no longer defended by the king, and the king has a little bit less cover. And that means white is going to be able to give a series of checks here with the king just running away from the queen. Let's see if Magnus can pull this off. Now, again, king to f8 would have repeated moves after queen d8 check, so Magnus going king g8, and then king h7, again, trying to get out of the way of a potential queen to f6 check idea. Now, from here, queen f6 from white. Magnus goes queen g6, offering the queen trade. Pentala Harikrishna denies it. Then queen e6. This turns out to be a very good central square for the queen, and here Magnus Carlsen finds a way to increase pressure on this pawn on the g5 square with his king. Now, Pentala goes queen d4. This is a big mistake. King to g6, and suddenly it's very hard for him to stop. Simply king takes g5, and that's what happens in the game. King to f1, king takes g5. Now Magnus is up 2 pawns. His pawns all being defended by the queen perfectly. And from here, Magnus Carlsen finds a way to slowly clean up in the game, bringing his king down to the middle of the board. He loses the pawn on the h5 square, but it's simply not enough. Here, Magnus Carlsen just slowly escorts his pawn down the board with his king, and in this position, Pentala Harikrishna resigned to Magnus Carlsen on the spot, as obviously Magnus finally found a way to force the queens off the board. White is going to have to go queen takes, then d takes c4, and here there's absolutely nothing stopping king b2, then c3, c2, c1, promoting to a queen, and Magnus Carlsen is going to win in short order. So wow, very impressive game by Magnus Carlsen in this video series. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video series on Magnus Carlsen and his brilliant Sveshnikov Sicilian defense. Now, if you enjoyed this video and got some value out of it, show me some love. Go ahead and smash that like button and the subscribe button. And while you're at it, check out my video on Ding Liren's incredible Catalan opening showing up on your screen right now. And I will see you in the next video.